your writing labor, your process.
It's not
You
very
mentioned
interesting,
journals.
really.
I don't know. You mentioned those little lines in journals,
Yeah,
revolutionizing form, moving from
yeah,
narrative. I think there's
yeah.
some stuff there.
Well, I have my preferred practice, and then I have what I kind of end up with, depending. Um, but my preferred practice is to begin with a question or a series of questions, for which I hope not to find an answer. Um, the, the, the exercise for me is framing the question, because knowing what the question is a kind of a step towards liberation. Liberation of the intellect, liberation of the craft, liberation of the individual. So I like to begin with a series of questions. History and Other Poems began with a question about the French word for slavery and enslavement. The word for that in French is subir, to cause someone to submit. And there's another word that escapes me right now. But these are relatively harmless words compared to the word enslave. And so I was working on one research project in the south of France, and I was sort of going through an encyclopedic dictionary of the French language. And late into the evening, when the library was about to close, which it never really officially closed, it was there at the residence where we all lived, and if you got locked in, you weren't going to be locked in. You could just, they would tell you lock the door when you leave. Okay. And there, before my eyes, just as I'm going through, just kind of flipping pages, was my word, esclaver. To enslave, literally. A beautiful word, actually, esclaver. But it says exactly what it is. But that word has not been in use for many, many years. It hasn't been used for centuries. So that one of the things that the French language does, French elides, and it elides its history as well. French language and French studies and French history pretend that there was no slavery. And one of the ways that you can make that pretense true is to erase a word, to take it out of usage, to pretend that it never existed. But there in some crusty, musty, old leather-bound dictionary that the gilt is falling off of is my word, esclaver. And that kind of fueled this project. Now, I don't think you get the word esclave anywhere in History and Other Poems, but it was, and one of the poems had been written many, many years ago, and it isn't the title poem. The title poem was another thing. But one of the poems was written many, many years ago. Oh, it's the poem I read, Slaves to the City. It was written many, many years before the book was even conceived. But I began to see that poem as an entree into this collection, this very small collection of poems on this very tight, I hope, a very tight topic. So language, if anything is a boundary, the very thing that we as poets work in, that thing is the boundary. We're continually required, and I think more so than other artists who work in language, and I rarely use the word artist to refer to writers, but there is a kind of technical skill isn't quite the word I want, but it's what I'll use for now. A kind of technical skill that's required to build up from language. And that's what we're doing. If you're writing a story, you have the story, both its content and its shape, as well as its characters, to keep everything going. For poetry, even narrative poetry, you really have only language. When the reader sits down to read, that's all the poet doesn't necessarily care about you. The poet isn't interested in your story, not necessarily. I usually am not, unless there's something in the poem that compels me to do that. But really all you have is that va-et-vient, that sway, that give and take of language. And mastery of language is the elusive thing. We're always trying for it. It sounds vain to say it, but it really isn't, since we can't ever get it.
It's very humbling, actually.
It's a nice thing to hope for, but you know you'll never get there. And so that's the thing, to have language is to be able to move a certain way in the world, in worlds.